If you've been watching my channel for a while and you've ever heard me read a story by Saturday, you know that their stories are insane. And with today's story, I almost thought for a second that it was going to be normal and have some, expected twist. But this one caught me off guard. So anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed this story as much as I did. Let's go ahead and get into it. Today's story is from r/no-sleep from user Saturday. We shrink wrap our dead. One of my earliest memories are from a funeral. At the time, I didn't understand that it was a funeral. It's a confusing thought. I wasn't scared or sad. It was just a lot of people that I knew gathered in one room. A lot of them were upset. That much I remember. But there was something else. There was a man in the room, resting on a big table. There was an older woman in a robe talking to us in a soft tone. At some point, my mother picked me up and we walked to the man on the table. He was being wrapped in plastic. I cried and my mother rocked me in her arms. I didn't understand that the man was dead, but how could I? I'd never seen anything die. A couple of the older kids were given blow dryers to help shrink the plastic. My mother put me down while she helped turn the body to get the wrapping right. I retreated to the end of the table, where I played with my favorite Ninja Turtle toy. When no one was looking, I pricked a hole in the plastic, just between the man's toes. It was an accident. I was playing, and the toy had a sharp edge. I was a bit embarrassed, so I didn't say anything. We all sat there for hours, singing songs and talking in hushed voices. The old woman in the robe was so kind and careful. I remember her stroking my hair and kissing me on the cheek. All the children of the town were there, both the infants and the teenagers. They didn't want us to sleep, but we couldn't help it. They gave us candy to keep us motivated, but I still nodded off. I was barely awake when I heard the noise. I remember the plastic turning this thick, ink-like black. Then something slipped out, right there in that hole I poked between his toes. Something moved. I remember drawing in a cold breath that made me choke. It was so cold that I could feel something crystallizing down my throat. My voice burned and my heart kept beating louder and louder. I didn't understand what was happening. The last thing I remember from that day was the kind old woman screaming at two men to hold me down as she hurried to me with a bone saw and an apologetic expression. Next thing I remember, I was in the hospital. It wasn't that bad. Getting fed through a tube in your arm is weird, but I got so many toys and comics from that day that it felt like Christmas all over. I had aches and pains, but they passed. Once I was okay, my parents sent me to live with my aunt in a neighboring town. I didn't like it, but they painted it as this great opportunity and a chance to meet new friends. They said it was temporary, and I believed them. I hadn't met enough liars to know the signs. That temporary solution lasted all through my childhood. My aunt's a wonderful woman, and how she managed to care for not only me, but my two cousins is beyond me. My parents would send her money, but they would never come to visit. We never talked about them, and when they passed in the winter of 2016, I wasn't told until long after their funeral. I can't say I miss them. I wish I could, but I can't. After high school, I decided to pursue a degree in anthropology. I don't want to attribute all my interest to that first memory, but I can't say it didn't have an impact on me. I had no idea why our burial ritual had been so strange compared to anything I've read. We bury our dead in coffins, in the ground, and cremate them. We don't shrink wrap them in front of an audience. For the longest time, I thought it was something I made up. A bad dream brought on by a nasty fever, but the more I thought about it, the more I had to know for sure. While studying for my master's degree, I decided I was going to write a paper about this custom. That is, if it was real to begin with. I had a couple of other topics lined up just in case. I asked my aunt about it. She wasn't too happy talking about the topic, as it brought up bad memories of my parents. She asked me to consider other ideas. However, I took note of something interesting. She never disputed the fact that the shrink wrapping was real. She would mention how that town wasn't a big deal and how it wasn't noteworthy. But she never said I was wrong. Side note, guys, how many rolls of cling wrap do you think it would take to wrap up a body? They had to drop at least a couple $100 on the stuff, right? Anyways, let's continue. The village is in rural South Dakota. If you follow the Runalong River, past the town of Hilltop and the wheat farms, and far enough to the northwest, There's a hillside community with about 550 people. Not a lot of folks choose to settle there as the place has spotty wireless and the roads have barely been maintained since the 70s. You'd be excused for not knowing it existed. Most people just notice their Wi-Fi going bad as they drive past. Those who live up there are mostly retirees, but there's a couple who make their living doing seasonal jobs for surrounding farms and ranchers. There's a grocery shop, a couple of truck drivers, and a church. If you follow the main road, you get to a bus stop. There's a preschool, but not a lot of children. Despite my aunt's disinterest, I decided to pursue this topic. I called up the village priest. The one I remembered was already an old woman, so I figured there'd be someone else attending the flock. Turns out, I was right. I got in touch with a man named Pastor Oswald. He picked up before the second dial tone. I was sitting in my car at the time, holding my phone with my cheek as I scribbled in my notebook. "Pastor Oswald," I asked. "Hope I got the right number." "Sorry, I don't get a lot of calls," he laughed. "Who am I speaking to?" I introduced myself as a master's student in anthropology and explained my interest in their burial rites. I didn't bring up the details of my past, thinking this person probably didn't know about me either way. I explained how I was there to interview and observe for academic purposes. Pastor Oswald waved it off. "No problem at all," he assured me. "We have a ceremony scheduled 2 days from now that you're welcome to attend. Respectfully, of course." How could I say no? I drove out there on the day of the ceremony. I was told it would be held later in the evening, so I had plenty of time to make myself reacquainted with the town. I took a detour off the highway and noticed my internet connection going spotty, so I knew it wasn't far. There was something familiar about the smell. It's strange how well something that small sticks with us. Just from taking a deep breath, I could tell I'd been there before. Springtime never really changes. It was just that time of year when it's still uncomfortably cold, but the sun shines so brightly it stings your eyes. Where a warm jacket is too much, but leaving it at home is too little. That in-between space where nature stays by the door like a cat, meowing at you to open, but not knowing if it wants to leave. I found the bus stop and subsequently the road leading into town. I don't think I've ever seen a more beaten up patch of asphalt. There had to be some other way for trucks to get up there that I didn't know about. I could hear my insurance premiums cry as the shock absorbers struggled to keep pace. The town church was a classic white with a small turn-of-the-century Midwestern bell tower. I couldn't see the bell though. There were a couple of cars parked outside, but no one seemed to be around. I knocked a couple of times on the big double doors, but no one answered. I figured I'd give Pastor Oswald a call, but I couldn't get a signal through. It was the middle of the day, but there were a couple of people milling about. Mostly older folks walking their dogs or buying groceries. Out of all the people that passed by, 3 of them were under the age of 60, and they might just have appeared younger than they really were. The grocery store had a bit of a cafe corner where you could sit down to have a sandwich. It wasn't so much a coffee place as it was a collection of chairs scattered around a handful of wobbly tables, with a couple of handwritten signs showing the price of drinks. It looked way too cheap, but that's probably because they hadn't adjusted for the past 6 years of inflation. I grabbed a seat by the window, looking out over an abandoned street. A couple of crows had made their way into a trash can and threw garbage out like there was no tomorrow. They looked like they knew what they were doing. More young birds than there were young people. As I sat down for lunch, a peculiar man walked in. He was in his early 50s, with a shaved head and a 5 o'clock shade lining his jaw. Bit of a beer belly, but he had these really clear green eyes. He gave me a long look, stopped, and circled back. He pointed a finger at me and cocked his head. "I know you," he stated. "How do I know you?" "I don't think you know me," I said. "Sorry." "Now hold on." He sat down across from me, still thinking out loud. Then, pointing again, he started listing names. My mother, my father, my aunt, a couple of my cousins. Then something clicked. He snapped his fingers. "Don't tell me," he said. "You're Henry's kid." "Got me there," I admitted. "You see the family resemblance?" "Don't you?" I raised an eyebrow at that. He looked at me like I was an idiot. "Jerry. Uncle Jerry. Dad's brother?" "I never heard of an Uncle Jerry." "Figures." He reached out a hand. I was hesitant at first, but he had a genuine smile. That, and he had managed to list a whole bunch of names from my family, some of which I barely remembered myself. He was the real deal in one way or another. I shook his hand as he started firing off a bunch of questions. We had a lot of catching up to do. We spoke for hours. He was pleasant to talk to, and the more I looked, the more of myself I could see in him. We had the same ears, for example, and the same space between our front teeth. I told him about my studies and the peculiar memory of the shrink wrapping. He perked up at that. "They still do that," he said. "It's the strangest thing." "You know what it's about?" "Yeah, I'm surprised you don't. Given the circumstance, you know." "What are you talking about?" I sipped my coffee as he gave me a curious look. He crossed his arms and leaned back in his seat. "They call it Good Friday lung. You had it as a kid, don't you remember?" Good Friday lung was a condition brought on by something in the soil. They didn't have an explanation for it, but it was something that occurred at about 3 to 5 days of decomposition. A person who died would exude this black smoke that made people sick. Apparently, that's something I got when I was younger. That would explain my memory. Burying them just makes it spread through the soil. Gets sucked up in the groundwater and the crops. Dangerous stuff. What about cremation? Burning them spreads it faster. It gets in the air like a cloud. A whole bunch of people died from that at the turn of the century, according to the church records. What about acid? Liquidation? Might work, but that'd be expensive as hell. You can't just get industrial-grade body-burning acid at a moment's notice. So yeah, we shrink wrap. Simple. I got to see it for myself. Well, you'll get to. Old Harlan passed a couple days ago. Sad to see the stuttering old fool go, but Jerry shrugged. That's life. I'd never heard of Good Friday lung. It sounded ridiculous. Apparently, it was some kind of aerial infection that affected people who'd lived in that town too long. They tried several techniques over the years, but shrink wrapping was the simplest and most cost-effective way to prevent any harm from spreading. It didn't quite explain everything. For example, why did they gather all the children at the ceremony? It seemed ill-advised to bring all the young to witness something so macabre. What Jerry had shared was a start, but it didn't quite paint the full picture. I'd never heard of anything like this, and yet they all accepted it like it was a part of everyday life. My estranged uncle was supportive of my research into the subject, albeit a bit less helpful than he might have wanted to be. For example, he had no idea where the condition originated. Apparently, it was just part of living by the river. Later that evening, people gathered at the church. Jerry was supposed to meet up with me a little later, so this was my chance to talk to Pastor Oswald and get a bit of history. The double doors were wide open, and a group of 24 people had already gathered. And there, on a stone altar at the very front, was an old dead man, as naked as the day he was born. Pastor Oswald spotted me across the room. Compared to most people living there, he was relatively young, only 40 or so years old. He had these big glasses and an aw shucks kind of demeanor to him. I can imagine exactly what this guy looks like based on that. That's funny. I could easily see him as someone willing to geek out at some kind of convention. He shook my hand and invited me in. "Glad to see a new face," he said. "These are trying times, but it's important to challenge perspectives. I hope I'm not interrupting. Just don't touch anything and you'll be fine." He showed me around the room and introduced me. There were 2 men by the back that were supposed to transport the body after the ceremony, locking it in a crypt. There were a couple of volunteers helping with the plastic wrapping and turning the body. Then there were the children. As part of the ceremony, about a dozen children were there to help out. Most of them were given blow dryers to help the plastic shrink in this vacuum-tight seal. I had a couple of questions about that. "Is there a particular reason why you're involving the children?" I asked. "They're most susceptible to the condition," he explained. "If someone gets sick, we need to know right away. That's why it's best to keep everyone around until we know the seal will hold. Involving them in the ceremony keeps them close and occupied." "Then why not keep them in the back or the other room?" "Then we can't immediately see if they get affected. They also get impatient from the waiting." "Then why are there no paramedics around, or doctors, maybe gas masks, or—" "It's not that kind of condition." While Pastor Oswald still smiled, I could tell there was something in my line of questioning that poked a nerve. I slowed down, brought out my notebook, and took it one question at a time. Then what kind of condition is it? Pastor Oswald mulled the question over as he double-checked his equipment. There was a veil that was supposed to go over the body once the ceremony was complete. There was a wheeled gurney to roll the body out, to be sealed in a communal crypt. Those things I expected, but what bothered me was the table with instruments and songs, flutes and tambourines, child-sized. We've had a lot of people trying to fix it over the years, he explained. They can't find a source. They can't even tell if you have it or not. It's not until the moment you lay dead and the decay sets in that the condition reveals itself. And by then, you want them contained. Exactly, he nodded. But as far as prevention goes, or the source of the contamination, your guess is as good as mine. I just know that it's been here a long time, and it'll probably be here long after you and I are gone. Then why not just move? Well, if you have it, you'll just be bringing it somewhere else. A lot of folks don't want to take that chance, so they've decided to stick around. But as you might have noticed, there's a lot less people living here than there used to be. So in a generation or two, who knows? He handed me a small bowl full of wrapped chocolate mints. I took one and smiled as he hurried off to help an older man with a walker. The ceremony started at about 9 p.m. Most people sat down in the pews, but the children were sat up front by the altar. Pastor Oswald spoke in a very calm and reassuring tone. He explained it as a blessing, a challenge of faith, to be overcome. In these trying modern times, we often forget about the imperceptible things that shape our lives. Things like the way the wind carries our breath, how the moon shines through our window when the power goes out, how faith lifts us out of bed to carry our burdens. But men like Harlan know of these things. They know them well. It was a beautiful speech. I remembered to take notes, but I was a bit distracted. I didn't even notice Uncle Jerry sneaking in to sit at my side. I was about to say something to him when he raised a finger to his lips, showing me I ought to stay quiet. Pastor Oswald painted this ceremony as a reassurance of faith, that we're willing to do what we must in order to retain the natural order of things, that we must not let Harlan be remembered as something harmful to the community. The ceremony was explained as tying a final ribbon on a life well lived. There were a lot of songs and hymns, some which I'd heard before, some not. Jerry seemed to know all of them by heart. Some kids helped out by playing simple instruments or tapping their feet. There was an older woman playing the church organ. Pastor Oswald had a surprisingly strong voice. Harlan's widow described her husband's love for the outdoors and how he loved to take moonlight walks by wheat fields. She urged everyone to take the scenic route home that night, as it was a full moon, to maybe get a sense of what he appreciated so much about the open sky. It was a nice thought, and I could see more than a few tears among the audience. Her jab about his chain smoking got a couple of laughs too. As the ceremony neared midnight, the children were asked to come up to the plastic-wrapped body with their blow dryers. As the machines began to whir, I could hear the plastic creak as the wrap tightened. It didn't take long. All of a sudden, the man on the altar had gone from a person to a package, anonymous and generic. As the songs continued, I noticed a shift in the room. The plastic was slowly turning gray, and the two men who were charged with moving the body were on high alert. But not towards the body. They were looking at the congregation, the children in particular. The parents were too. It's like no one was really watching the dead body in the room. Something was changing. As the plastic turned completely black, everyone seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. The plastic seal seemed to hold. Pastor Oswald cheered, and the congregation cheered with him as they celebrated and gave thanks. The body was carefully moved to the wheeled gurney and covered in a thin veil. The two men wheeled the body out, and I got up to follow them. Pastor Oswald stopped me with a hand on my shoulder. "I'm sorry, but you can't come with them. It's a safety measure." "Not even from a distance?" He rolled his eyes a little and looked around the room. One of the kids was pulling on his sleeve, demanding his attention. "All right, from a distance," he agreed. "Just don't touch anything, you understand? I'll keep my distance." He mouthed a silent thank you as he diverted his attention to a young boy wanting to show off his tambourine skills. Most of the children were being taken home. The ritual was over. I followed the two men outside. There were no graves, only mausoleums. The men stopped as they realized I was following, but I assured them I'd keep my distance. They nodded at that and continued rolling the body down a path. The wheels on the gurney struggled against the gravel. They were in the middle of a casual conversation, not really related to anything. Perhaps this was a bit of routine for them. Given the average age of those who lived there, that wouldn't surprise me. They were discussing one of them buying a new car from a less than reputable dealer and the pros and cons of such an investment. Halfway down the line of mausoleums, they stopped. Turns out they'd messed up the number and taken a wrong turn. They had to backtrack and go around. It was a bit of a hassle, so before they did, they decided to go on a smoke break. As promised, I kept my distance as they left the body on the table. There was no wind and the gurney was steady. There was no harm to it. I joined them in their discussion, trying not to impose. I asked a couple of practical questions about the ceremony and the history of their role. I made a couple of notes about how they were called ferrymen before they returned to their topic of secondhand cars. As they did, my ears perked up. I was hearing something, but I couldn't put my finger on what. I looked around for Jerry, but he was still inside with the others. It was something else. Not a breeze rustling the leaves, not a single drop of rain. No smell coming from the dry old blue sunflowers resting by the mausoleum door. No, it was something much more mundane. A crow. The ferryman hadn't noticed it. It had landed on the edge of the gurney, thinking the plastic wrap held some kind of trash-like delicacy. These birds were hard-coded to tear through wrapping to find the goodies inside, and it didn't take long to act on those impulses. By the time the ferryman noticed, it was too late. The crow poked its beak straight through the plastic as black gas seeped out. It's hard to explain exactly what it looked like. It was a gas, but it moved like a liquid. But that's just the thing. It moved. Not just poured out, it moved with purpose. It swayed from side to side before dissolving into the ground. The ferryman freaked out as a confused crow took flight. Damn it! Gosh damn it, he got out. One of them sprinted for the church. The other hurried up to the gurney and brought out 3 sets of straps from underneath. He positioned them over the legs, chest, and head of the body in a trained routine. Seconds later, the body moved. It wasn't a conscious movement as much as a spasm. Some dying mechanism triggering at full power, causing the whole body to flex. If he hadn't tightened the straps, more of the plastic would have ripped. There was still some black inside. Using duct tape, he secured the hole the crow had poked. Get inside, he screamed. Get inside now. It was full panic inside the church. The children who hadn't left yet were being held to the floor by their parents. The other ferryman was sprinting to his car to get the others. Pastor Oswald held a walkie-talkie in his left hand and a bone saw in his right. I walked up to him, watching his demeanor change from calm and collected to borderline frantic. What is the bone saw for? I asked. He looked up at me, but didn't answer. He kept his eyes trained on the children. What is the bone saw for? I repeated. He swallowed hard, regaining his composure. Safety measures. I get the OP has a report to do, but I don't know about you guys. We're running for the hills, right? Like, at this point, mysterious black mist, and now the pastor's holding a bone saw. Later. Sorry, let's continue. Pastor Oswald got regular updates through his walkie-talkie. They were going house by house, checking all the children in town. What exactly they were checking for wasn't apparent. They were doing a sort of head count, listing off the family names of those cleared. The kids who were held down were being let up as suspicions faded. Things seemed to be okay for now. Check the wheat fields, Pastor Oswald demanded. Harlan liked the wheat fields. I noted it in my book and looked for Uncle Jerry. He was off in the corner, staying well out of everyone's way. I hurried up to him. I barely got the question out of my mouth before he answered it. It's not just a lung disease, he whispered. It's unnatural, defiant. I don't understand. Some things don't work as they're supposed to, he explained. When explanation fails to account for impossible things, sometimes we just have to make do with what works. Then explain it. Explain what you think happens. He looked at me, then back at the congregation. The tension was starting to subside. Old Harlan didn't want to go yet, he said, so he clawed his way back for one more go. He just needs to find someone willing to carry on for him. Like a possession? Jerry looked around the room and gave me the tiniest nod. As the congregation's tolerance to outsiders waned, Pastor Oswald hurriedly asked me to leave. He wasn't harsh about it, but rather matter-of-factly. This was a time of crisis in his community, and he couldn't take the time to be a good host. He insisted I come back in a couple of days when things calmed down, and he'd be happy to explain exactly what happened. But for now, I had to leave. I got in my car, waved goodbye to Uncle Jerry, and slowly made my way out of town. Not exactly the way I'd expected my day to go, but I wasn't about to intrude. Not on a night like this. I carefully bumped my way down the shitty road leading out of town and took a left. My car kept complaining about the Wi-Fi connection. I followed the road curling back and forth. There were no street lights, but the moon was as large as ever. That, and I wasn't really expecting to see a lot of people on these roads. That is, until I noticed something up ahead. There was a car in the middle of the road. The motor was still running. I could see the exhaust. The driver's side door was wide open and covered in blood. I stayed in my car, trying to get a signal on my phone. It didn't work. I shuffled my way out the door. I had to check if someone was injured. I mean, it sure looked like someone was injured, but there was no damage to the car. They hadn't hit anything. There was just a lot of open doors and blood, especially in the driver's seat. I called out to see if there was anyone there, but no one responded. The keys were still in the ignition. There was a comic book in the back seat. It was torn in half. I turned back towards my car and stopped. There was someone standing next to it, looking in through the window. The silhouette was barely covered by the moonlight, showing a figure with one arm much bigger than the other. A tilted torso shaped like a lowercase b. I could see the gleam of white in their eyes, but there was too much of it. Too many. It turned to me, still holding something in its left hand. It left a bloody handprint on my car. It tried to speak, but all that came out was a painful, drawn-out wailing. It was fast, much faster than me for sure. The moment it started running, I was only about 6 steps ahead. I threw myself into the parked car and slammed the driver's side door shut. I crawled over to the passenger side as the door was torn straight off and thrown down the road. I crawled out the other side and shut the passenger door behind me, trapping whatever was coming for me in the car, at least for a couple of seconds. It didn't take long for it to break through. I couldn't just run down the road in a straight line, it would catch me. I had to try and lose it. There was a wheat field on the left side of the road, and I figured I could lose it in there. I ran straight into it, keeping my head down and slowing only to hide my sound. I could hear something following me, something frustrated with a deep, wheezing breath, like a man slowly choking to death. I managed to find a spot in the middle of the field where I could duck down. It was right by the edge, in the shade of a tree. There was no way that thing would accidentally find me here. I listened to it shuffling about. It was nowhere near me, but I could tell there was something wrong with it. Its proportions were wrong. The sounds were wrong. It tried to speak, but it turned into either screams or a strangely coherent stutter. It sounded like words, but I couldn't make them out. Then I looked up. A family of crows tilted their heads down at me. One of them hopped along a branch, inspected me, and cawed. The others followed suit. I don't think they meant anything bad, but they drew attention to me. Soon, that thing was coming my way. I tried to get away, but even at a sprint, I was nowhere near as fast. I remember something knocking me to the ground and putting a foot on my back. At least I think it was a foot. It was big enough to be a car tire. Something wrapped around my ankle and twisted. Twisted, pulled, and twisted again. I'm not going to try and explain the pain of several compound fractures to someone who has never broken a bone, but it's a terrifying violation. Your body is being willfully and forcefully disfigured in a way it never has. That thing was tearing off my leg at the knee. And it did. I've experienced pain and fear before, but the mortality of imminent death is something that's hard to explain. It's a category of its own. There's a searing pain in your nerves, an intense scalding heat, and as that heat grows ever worse, the rest of your body grows cold. You start to focus on such pinprick, minute details. The exact shape of a leaf on the ground, the texture of a grain of sand. Your mouth turns dry as you realize you can't force your eyes into focus. I was lying there on my stomach, my head to the side, bleeding out. The big thing lumbered away as someone joined me at my side. A man sat down in the grass, leaning against a tree. The crows didn't seem to react to him like they did with me. It was Uncle Jerry. They don't mean to do it, he said. They're not even scared. It's just like clawing your way to the surface for air. It's what comes naturally. I couldn't answer. I was trying to conserve my breath. This happened to you too, he continued, back when I went. Oh my gosh. Sorry guys, that's crazy. The chills I just got. So the funeral that he got Good Friday long was Uncle Jerry's funeral. But wait, hold on, we gotta read more. My eyes rolled, looking for him. I saw his shape, but it was diffuse, transparent. They got most of me out before I caught hold, cut the extra arms off and all, but part of me is still in there, just a bit distant. I could hear something shuffling around in the field. Whatever did this to me was still out there. I'm not here to gloat, Jerry explained. I've had time to calm down, to come to terms with things. Your life is yours. I accept that. Honestly, I'm just glad we had a chance to talk. He leaned in close, stroking my hair. I remember back when I was small, crying in my mother's arms. He was the man on the table, all those years. If you let me in, I'll make this work. Just this once. What do you say? I couldn't say anything, but I didn't have to. He knew my answer. I would do anything for a couple more breaths. I felt my pulse slow. I could focus, not just on a single straw of grass, but the whole field. I could wet my tongue and wipe the sweat from my brow. I scooched a little, expecting a fountain of pain for my missing leg, but nothing came of it. Looking down, I was fine. I had a new leg. The skin and hair of it looked a little darker, but it was a leg. It just wasn't mine. It took some time to get used to. By the time I got up off the ground, the thing was still running through the fields, tearing up swaths of wheat and wailing at the top of its lungs. It would stop at times to cough and wheeze, looking up at the moon. It seemed fascinated by it, like it really enjoyed the outdoors while simultaneously letting out a terrified scream. 2 wills, 1 body. I made my way back to the main road. There were more cars there. The ferrymen, along with a couple of volunteers. They were armed. The headlights from their cars cast these long shadows stretching down the road, highlighting the blood, some of which was mine, dripping from the torn edge of my pant leg. It's in the fields, I said, pointing. It's big. Just the one? Just one. They fanned out and readied their weapons. The last thing I heard before they entered the wheat field was a silent, sorry Harland. Seconds later, they were shooting. I sat down in my car, adjusting the seat to the new length of my leg. I heard the shooting, then the shooting stopped. They burned something in the field and dragged the abandoned car off the road. A couple days later, I talked to my aunt. She confirmed that I had had an Uncle Jerry and that I went to his funeral as a kid. That was the time I caught Good Friday long. Apparently, I was one of the first kids to survive it. She didn't want to get into specifics, but it had been violent. You have to do something terrible to stop it from expanding in a host. Researching it further, the best explanation of the condition is that a newly dead body sort of finds its way into a younger one, like a person desperate for air, except 2 people can't inhabit the same space. It collides, creating something twisted and in between. It can be stopped if noticed immediately, but even then, chances are slim. I wrote a paper about it, but it was rejected. I had to go to one of my backup subjects. This was a couple of years ago, and I've tried to gain some legitimacy. I've had my leg tested, but they haven't found a reason why it looks so different, or is of different length. Yes, at glance, it looks like something just slap grafted onto my knee, but that explanation has been denied several times. There's no scar tissue, no mending marks on the bone, nothing. It's like it was supposed to be there. And of course, I wonder if this is going to happen to me someday. I was born there, but I haven't lived there. How can you know whether you're part of this chain or not? You won't know for sure until you're gone, and by then, you're not experiencing anything. Or maybe in the case of Harland, you are. Do I want to? What's the alternative? I have plenty of years left to consider this, and I don't think I'll ever have a clear answer. Just to be sure, I think I'll have a final request upon my passing. Make sure my body is properly shrink-wrapped. You know, I gotta say, Saturday had me in the first half. I wasn't really sure where this one was going, but Uncle Jerry I thought was super chill. Like, he seemed like a cool uncle that just unfortunately lost contact with his nephew, but man, definitely huge kudos to Saturdead for another amazing story. Like, their writing is just so good, I swear. Anyways, that's all the scary Reddit stories in Minecraft I have for you today. Huge shout out to my channel members. Thank you so much for your support on the channel. If you guys do want to further support the channel, that link is in the description. However, it is completely optional. Definitely drop a like and subscribe if you enjoyed today's video, as I upload almost every day. And with all that said, I will see you tomorrow.